Is my mic on? Excellent. All right, audio check in the back of the room. Can you hear me? Okay, great. All right, let us continue on after our break, and we are going to do session 2. And let me also give an apology. Thanks to me sending the wrong file by email to the poor organizers, what they have in their schedule and what I had attended are not the same. So here, in contrast to what is on the schedule, here is actually our schedule in a little more detail. Not that I expect you to memorize that, but just so that at some point in the video stream, we have that schedule. And maybe we will get it fixed on the web pages sometime soon, but the fault is mine for sending the wrong year's file to the tech chairs. So back to what we're actually doing. So let us continue on. What we covered before the break was big picture of analysis, and then a little bit on marks and channels, and then talking about how to deal with 2 of those 3 data types, tabular and spatial data. What we will now continue on with is how do we use spatial position to illustrate networks and trees. I'll also mention that all of these slides are available at that URL for people that want, particularly for the further reading links, but also, of course, for the slides themselves. All right. So what are the big ideas when we are using spatial position to express what is happening with network data where we have nodes and links together? So there's 3 main ways of doing this when we think about it from the point of view of marks and channels and visualization idioms. There's using links to connect nodes, so using the connection marks quite literally to show node link graphs with node link representations. There's deriving a table to make an adjacency matrix, and there's using containment marks to enclose to show the hierarchical structure that we get with trees in particular. So let's look at some examples of those. So a very common idiom for looking at node link graphs is force-directed placement. So what's going on with that? Well, in this case, our visual encoding is that we're showing a node link graph with a node link diagram, maybe not very surprising. So, you know, the nodes are points, we've got connection marks, which are those links. It's very literal. So there's many, many forms of node link layouts. This is a particular one. And in this one, the algorithm under the hood is, you can think of this as an energy minimization approach. You often have the analogy of a physical system where you've got nodes that are like repelling magnet forces and links are drawing them together like springs. And you can basically frame this as a very nice optimization problem. And then you can pick criteria like, well, minimizing things might be one of the things you might try. And often you have multiple criteria. Some are things you're trying to maximize, some are things you're trying to minimize, and so you can just think of it as a nice optimization problem. So that's an algorithmic statement about what's happening. So what does that mean in terms of visual encoding? What is the idiom actually doing here? And what's interestingly different with this compared to what we talked about before the break was, well, we're not directly encoding anything. Spatial position isn't directly meaning something. Instead, it's indirectly being used. So sometimes proximity ends up being meaningful, right? You know, the fact that this cluster of nodes is close together spatially is actually showing us something about the topological structure, that there's a bunch of interconnections, so those springs drew the nodes close together. But sometimes proximity is a completely arbitrary thing that just happened to come out because the layout algorithm was started with some particular random position of nodes. Like, for example, you know, the question of whether this blue cluster is exactly where it is between these other light blue ones, or maybe it might end up actually being more over down here, that's very possible. So one of the issues with this kind of force-directed placement is you don't get a lot of spatial stability. Sometimes it's possible to run the same data set and see quite a different layout just from the point of view of raw pixels. And there are ways of trying to add some spatial stability into these by, for example, using the same random seeds as the starting point positions of these nodes. But in general, just raw force-directed placement doesn't guarantee anything. It's not directly encoding things with spatial position. So this is an interesting thing where the analysis of this is actually quite tricky. It's not straightforward like with those statistical graphics of things like bar charts and line charts and so on. So what tasks are well supported with this approach? Well, for one thing, there's exploring topological structure, right? We're actually drawing in these nodes, which means you can start following them. Of course, if there's too much clutter, it can be hard to do this path following. But you can also really definitely see clusters, right? You can immediately notice clusters with this kind of a layout. So you might have the problem where the clusters are so densely connected it gets hard to see other things. So visual clutter is very much an issue on this. So one of the rules of thumb is if you've got less than about 4 times the number of edges as nodes, you would be in a reasonable place using these kinds of node link drawings. If the graph is more dense, you're typically going to have so much visual clutter it's almost hopeless. And so from a graph theoretic point of view, 4n is actually quite small, right? The theoretical limit could be n squared. So this is actually only really a good idea when your graphs are quite sparse by graph theoretic measures. So what else could we do? Well, we could derive data. So remember how we talked about deriving data before? So one thing we could do is we could take this network data and we could transform it into tabular data. We can always do data transformations, and they can even change data type. And so the simple way to think about this is that you take the nodes and you essentially lay them out, and you form a matrix by laying out the nodes both horizontally and vertically, and then you fill in something if there is an edge between those 2 nodes. And you see a nice, very simple example from a paper by Nathalie Henry and Jean-Daniel Fouquet and Michael McGuffin that's a nice illustrative example of a matrix view versus a sort of simple node link view. Now let's look at one that's a little bit more complex, and you can start to see some of the trade-offs, right? This region here, which is basically so dense there's a lot of overplotting, we can actually see that there is some cluster structure here. Now, typically people have to be taught a bit about how it is to read these adjacency matrices to see cluster structure, but that is definitely something that can be presented in a fairly straightforward way. Part of what you typically want to do with these adjacency matrix views is actually reorder the matrix so that you do have as clear a description of the cluster structure as possible. And that's something that there are algorithms to do. There's a whole family of algorithms. There have been at least 4 or 5 different fields in which these have been posited, and everyone comes up with a different name. Some call it matrix reordering, some call it biseriation. So there's a lot of different words for this in the literature. In the further reading, there'll be some pointers to that. But what I want to think about is scalability. What can you do here? Well, typically, if you've got around 1,000 nodes, there could be up to 1 million edges. That's that n squared factor. And you could, in fact, in the limit, if you had 1,000 pixels in each direction, 1 pixel per node, you could see at 1 pixel per edge, actually see that entire graph without any overplotting or clutter. So these are very good at scale compared to node link diagrams, and they handle density. Well, what are they not so good at? From a task point of view, path tracing is much, much harder in these views. These views are not well suited for path tracing compared to node link views. So you don't suffer from visual clutter, but path tracing is extremely difficult. So there's a trade-off. So there's strengths and weaknesses, right? These are 2 different visualization idioms. What's great about an adjacency matrix also is the predictability. You know how much space you need. With node link graphs, depending on their exact structure, you might need more or fewer numbers of pixels to actually draw that if you have something you want, like the nodes are all of a particular size. Whereas you can just compute that directly with an adjacency matrix. So they do scale, they support this reordering to actually show the clusters more directly. And it is possible to show people some questions that have to do with topology and let them read those off these graphs. What's great about a node link diagram? If you handed somebody a napkin and you asked them to draw you a picture of the graph, that's probably what they would do. It's very intuitive, it's very familiar. People typically don't need a lot of training to do things like trace a path, they do that automatically. So there's been some work on the trade-offs between these. One of the early papers was from Goniem and Fouquet. And so if your network is small, node link is great. If your network is large and you don't need to do any topological tasks, Adjacency matrices are great. What if your graph is large and you do need to do topological tasks? This is why we have thousands of papers on graph drawing. So all kinds of approaches of heuristics trying to take into account anything that's known about the structure of the graph and exploit that. So graph drawing is all about understanding the use case and trying to come up with some heuristics to actually do something reasonable. So super fun area. I myself work in it a lot, so I have a soft spot in my heart for it. So what about the special case where you don't have many possible parents for a node? You have a single parent for each node. That's a situation where we have a tree rather than a general graph. So there's been many algorithms proposed to try to make good use of visual space, that is good information density. Here's one example. Notice how this is being shown radially rather than rectilinearly. There's quite a lot of both radial and rectilinear graph drawing algorithms out there. Notice how a lot of these examples, if people want to play around with them, there's links in the slides to go directly to not only being able to play with interactivity in some cases, but also code. So what have we got here? Well, same thing. We still have nodes and links. And we are showing the links as connection marks. We've got this radial orientation. Notice how we are directly encoding things like depth in the tree as distance from the center. Siblings are next to each other. So again, what task is this good for? Well, topological structure, path following. So what's the scale? Well, it depends on whether or not you need readable labels. If you need readable labels, then probably the limit is about 1,000 nodes because you actually have to take into account that. And of course, things like radial layouts, it's harder to read than if the text were actually axis aligned to the screen. But there's a trade-off here about aspect ratio. If you don't need to actually show labels and you just need people to focus on the topological structure, then you might be able to fit something like, say, 10,000 nodes. But you're definitely not going to be able to see 1 million nodes with this approach to tree drawing. What is another way to draw a tree? Well, we can use enclosure marks rather than connection marks, and let's think about what that's good for. So with the tree map algorithm, so we not only think about having a tree, but we think that at each of the leaf nodes, we have an attribute that we want to encode. One classic thing these are used for is actually looking at your file system and finding where are those giant files that have stolen half of your disk space that you didn't even know were there. So in that case, your attribute would be the size of the file. And so what we're doing is we are using area marks containing to show the hierarchical structure of the tree. But that's much less obvious. Topological structure is less obvious than it is with those node link diagrams. But it's very good at letting us show an attribute, which would be much more subtle if we did something like, tried to color code something or saturation code. If we had a node link diagram and we were just looking at trying to maybe color code here, it would be much more subtle than here where it leaps out at you. So for the task of understanding the attribute structure at the leaves, tree maps are great. They're also great for some of the same reasons that those adjacency matrices are great. There's a sort of computable known structure, and in the limit, if you had, say, 1 pixel per, or just a few pixels for every one of the leaf nodes, you could maybe scale up to 1 million if you had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels to work with. So again, we can think, what are the trade-offs between these alternatives? Connection versus containment. So in the one-dimensional case of connection, all the node link diagrams are using connection. It's great if you care about topology and path tracing. That using containment is typically only done for trees rather than for networks, because that hierarchical structure of 1 parent per child is something you only have a guarantee of with tree data sets. And you can see just from these simple versions here that they're really emphasizing very different things. So if you want to emphasize an attribute on the graph, then containment can be really great because you can size code by that attribute. So, and of course, there's all kinds of hybrid approaches that people have used that try to mix the best of both possible worlds. But for now, we're just sort of thinking about these as major families of idioms. So lots more further reading about networks. In particular, if you're interested in doing any kind of implementation, Michael McGuffin just has this lovely article, which is a great place to get started on a lot of the basic algorithms for graphs. I'll also point you to TreeViz, which is hundreds and hundreds of ways to lay out trees. if you want to get a sense of what that design space is like, trivias.net is a great resource for that. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions so far on the Slido, which does not yet have questions. I realize we're synced a little bit off, so we'll wait a few moments to see if any show up. In the meantime, for this one, maybe people should do a quick stretch in their chairs because it's getting on to the afternoon, which means it might be getting on towards nap time. So good to wake up a little bit. All right, let's blast onward to color, and there may well be more questions after that, because there always are, because everyone has questions of color. All right, how are we doing on time? So far, we've been really focused on those questions of use of space, arranging things in space. But what about color? So let's dive deeper into that. So the first rule of color is don't talk about color. Color is extraordinarily confusing if you treat it as a monolithic entity. So what we really need to do is decompose color into 3 channels: luminance, saturation, and hue. Hue is what you think of as color, like I am wearing a blue shirt and she is wearing a pink sweater. Saturation is kind of the colorfulness of that color, right? Like hot pink versus light pink versus just a dull gray. And then luminance is the amount of brightness something is, you know, all the way from white to black through gray. So 2 of these are magnitude channels, luminance and saturation, right? That's in the middle of this and that. One of them is categorical. It's great at showing identity, the blue thing versus the red thing. But it's actually terrible at showing order. That was the question from Gordon at the end of one of the previous sessions, which is, but you know, people keep wanting to show order with hue, and in fact, it's bad at that, as we will dive into. So this is a perceptual color space that more matches what the human visual system is doing, as opposed to those of you who originally learned about color and computer graphics probably learned about RG&B as ways to specify colors. So RGB is much more tuned to the characteristics of physical displays, whereas this is much more about how the human perceptual system uses color. If we had more time, we'd get much deeper into this. It's a fabulous topic, and people like Teresa Marie Ryan have done entire tutorials just on color. But we have only finite time, so we will do what we can in the time we have. So what I do want you to know about luminance is it's how you see edges. So here are some great slides I grabbed from Marine Stone that decompose a picture into the luminance part and the color part. And notice how you know what's going on. It's an apple tree in the black and white, and all you see are blobs of color in the color one. So the part you need to know as viz designers, first of all, is if you want them to see fine-grained detail, the only way they'll see that is luminance contrast. It's how our system detects edges. In particular, remember that to have text be legible, you need adequate luminance contrast. So this is one of the things a lot of people forget or get wrong. So one of the reasons that these color spaces are better is that understanding things like RGB don't help you think perceptually, but be aware that in a lot of the color pickers you'll see in everyday tools, you'll see an L in there, but that's not actually luminance. In HSL color pickers, the L is standing for lightness, and it's not this thing that more technically we might call L star, which is luminance. Although I'm not going to get deep into color spaces because of lack of time, I do want people to know that in those color pickers, all these colors end up being the same level of gray, even though their luminance is really, really different. So beware. Most existing tools don't really let you work in this true perceptual color space. They let you play nicely with hue and saturation, but they fall short on luminance. There are some color pickers out there that will let you look at what's called CIE lab for L star, A star, B star. Those are ones that are a little bit more directly perceptual. What are some other things that go wrong with color? People desperately want you to be able to see more than you can actually see with color. So the challenge here is that what people want is to color code 20 things. And it's so tempting to think that you can, because if you look at this picture over here, and this is actually showing where various things on the mouse chromosomes map to on the human chromosome. And if all you want to know is, oh my God, chaos, well, okay. But if you actually wanted to read things off, you know, there's about 7 different shades of green, and maybe we can tell the difference between 2 of them. When they're right next to each other, really subtle things can be noticed. But the way that the human perceptual system works is about very relative things rather than understanding absolute things. So once we go looking over at these, we really can only distinguish about maybe 7 or 8 colors. And our mind just sort of merges the others. And the problem is, if what you really need to do is understand the difference between 7 and 8, it's hard. Whereas the difference between 17 and 4 is easy. And so you might have a situation where things that are sort of equally different in data space are very, very either similar or different to each other in perceptual space. So in general, a good rule of thumb is count on 6 to 12 bins with color if you have small regions that are scattered apart, that are not right next to each other, but small non-contiguous regions. You know, 6 to 12 is safe. Remember, you'll need a background color. You might need a highlight color. You might need kind of a standard default color in addition to any others. So it's a really stringent constraint. And if your question is, but I have 20 things, what shall I do? There are many answers. One is use something besides color to encode. We have many other channels available. One is to deliberately group them, cluster them into a smaller number. It could be that you have the first 6 things and then a category for everything else. If your data follows a power law, that might be perfectly reasonable. So there are many things where you could deliberately aggregate. What you want to avoid is a situation where, because you didn't understand the complexities, they're aggregating in a way that you didn't have in mind by mapping a bunch of things you wanted to be different into the same bin perceptually. What else can go wrong? Well, everyone wants to use rainbows because they think they're natural. Well, they're natural for physics, but they're not natural for the biology of human vision. And one issue is that they're perceptually not ordered, and also that they're perceptually not linear. So if I gave you 4 paint chips and I locked you in a room and I gave this same 4 paint chips to your friend and I took away your phone so you couldn't talk to each other, if those were like black and light gray and dark gray and white and I told you to put them in order, you'd get it. You guys would match. I'd bet money on it. So if I said, you know, from most bright to least bright, if I gave you purple and blue and orange and green and I told you put them in order, they might not match. Because even though this is what light does physically, we don't just directly perceive an ordering for color. That nonlinearity problem is also a problem. Notice how in this rainbow, you can sort of see on the one on the left, you've got orange and yellow, and you can really tell the difference. And in the one on the right, you have green. It just is all green. So depending on what parts of your data are mapped to where in this color ramp, you're not necessarily going to be able to see changes. So you never want something where changes in data space are really non-linearly mapped to changes in perceptual space. What's good about it? It's actually a contentious topic. There's been a lot of study on this. One nice thing is you get a lot of fine-grained structure from all these different nameable colors. So the variation in hue allows you to talk about like the red parts and the yellow parts and the green parts and the light blue parts and the dark blue parts. So that part can be very effective. You know, there are some costs. If you look at this and I say, well, what is going on in this picture? Well, you know, there's some blobs. There's a lot of yellow. What do you see that's the difference between these two? Well, we saw a lot of fine-grained structure on the left, and we actually maybe are much more able to see large-scale structure by using a lot fewer hues. So depending on what you want to emphasize, large versus small-scale structure, you might pick really different color maps. This is a nice bunch of examples from Bernice Rogowitz. So what's going on with that one here? Turns out that's actually Florida. We'll be there in a couple of years at Viz. What's going on is now we've very deliberately segmented the color map so that exactly at that place of 0, which is sea level, the difference between water and land, we see that really clearly, whereas it's in almost the worst part where we have this very high brightness yellow and it's very hard to see them in the picture on the left. So carefully chosen color maps can really show you much more structure. So if you want a lot of the benefits of the rainbow without all of the hazards, one of the best thing you can do is to try to have a color map where you do have lots of hues, but you sort them by luminance. So monotonically increasing luminance in the color map. Viridis and its sister Magma are really nice examples of this. They've caught on quite a bit. They're quite good if you're dealing with sequential color, going from a min to a max, because they have a lot of colors, but they're ordered by their luminance so that you can both have the nameability of the multiple hues for that identity channel and the how much magnitude channel with the luminance. So right now they're implemented in pretty much every major toolkit. It's also nice that they're colorblind safe. We're not going to have the time to get deep into color blindness today, but it's particularly important to think about it when designing. So, but I don't want you to walk away thinking rainbows are always bad. If you've got categorical data, then very, very bright, highly saturated colors are great, especially if you're going to have small little regions that are spread apart, because the smaller something is, the more saturated you need if you're going to actually be able to perceive it. So if you've got categorical data, then something that looks a lot like a rainbow can be very, very good. So just keep in mind that there's nuance. It's not that you should always say rainbow's bad. There are situations where they are good and bad, but be aware of some of these issues. So coming back to kind of more of an overview of what's going on with color maps, you might use color to have categorical data. You might want to either show sequential or diverging data. How can we do this? Well, we can have color maps where there is a middle point and they diverge, or we can have color maps that range from a min to a max. Or with the categorical ones, we could have color maps that are deliberately as different as possible. Now, be aware that people often want to have what's called bivariate color maps. They want to encode two different attributes with color. Everyone always wants to do this. Be aware that it can be quite tricky to interpret. So it is possible to have these, even when carefully designed, these color maps that are actually trying to systematically vary two parts of color are notoriously difficult for people to interpret. But the easy case where they actually can interpret it better is this one where if you really have systematic variation of hues, and then you just have changes in saturation, so you basically have a more and less saturated one. So if you have a binary attribute in one case, and then you're varying, that is typically much easier for people to understand and reason about. So this is the safer case of a bivariate color map. So be aware, as I mentioned earlier, size really affects the visual salience of color. So small regions need high saturation to be noticeable. But then conversely, if you have huge regions and you have a highly saturated color, it kind of fries your eyes. So think about low saturation for large regions, high saturation for small regions, and be aware that we can't really say that many different bins. As I mentioned before, when I said if we had red and green, we could maybe see a total of 10 levels, which includes the black and the full saturation. So maybe 3 or 4 bins max. Certainly 2 bins is quite safe of low and high saturation. And also be aware that both luminance and saturation, you typically don't want to encode different things because they really end up being perceived as very similar. And similarly for transparency. So definitely don't have 3 attributes that you separately code: saturation, luminance, and transparency. No, 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 no. If you use one of them, don't try using the other 2. So much, much more to talk about with color. I particularly like Maureen Stone's Guide to Digital Color. I grabbed some of my slides from her. All kinds of activity in this. So we will see if there are any color questions in the Slido. So let's see, what are the roles of interactivities in increasing scalability? For example, okay, so these were back in networks. I am going to go ahead and answer a networks question. So in the case of the adjacency matrix, could we increase scalability by isolating particular cells? So the short answer is yes. Interactivity absolutely is something that we're going to use to try to deal with scale and complexity, but I'm going to get to that in another section right after this one. So I'll come back to that question. One that actually is about color. How important is it to be inclusive when selecting a color palette, or should one focus on a color map that's more tuned for people with normal vision? And my answer to that is it depends. So a statistic to be aware of is that something like in the male population, around 8% are going to have color deficiencies. So that's a major issue. On the other hand, it may even be more important to worry about luminance contrast, because a lot more people, including ones getting older like me, have troubles reading. And so their color blindness is often talked about a lot in Viz, but there's other things that are also arguably even more important for people with low vision, but that's more about the ability to decode things with poor luminance contrast. If we had more time to talk about color deficiency, what I would point out is some of the rules of thumb are don't only use differences of hue. You could also, for example, redundantly encode with both something like, say, hue and shape, or icons, various ways to say redundantly encode so that you're not only using hue. If you do need to use hue, there are color maps like blue to orange that are much safer than red to green. So there are definitely strategies for this. I don't have time to get too deep into it today. Any comments about the dynamic scalar range problem when mapping colors? The short answer is no, because I'm not quite sure what you mean by the dynamic scalar range problem. So if you could explicate in a little more detail. But I'm assuming what you might mean is maybe the fact that in general, you might have a situation where you have a data set where the question is, what do you have as the min and what do you have as the max? And how do you map that to your color map? And it could be that in a particular data set, say, if you're trying to map in one, you might have a range that goes from 0 to 10. And in another, you'd have one that goes from 0 to 1,000. So you're not necessarily using the full dynamic range of the color map with one versus the other. So if you separately normalize, then it's very hard to compare between data sets. If you don't, then you basically can't see any of the variation in one. So if that's what you mean, the short answer is that's a situation where it's not just an issue with color, that's more of a general issue of how do you deal with that kind of dynamic range. Typically, you want to signal very clearly to your users what you're doing. You often want to have modes where you can switch between essentially normalizing individually, maybe across an attribute or across a data set, versus normalizing across many. And you often want to give the user explicit control about no normalization at all, within something normalizing, or across many things normalizing. That is one way to handle that. I'll check back on the Slido after to see if that question got any more explicated later. But for now, what I want to do is move on to interactivity, since we are once again a little bit behind. So we had been way over on the left side, and what I want to do now is switch from focusing just on visual encoding to focusing more on interactivity. And I'm defining that very, very broadly, but I'm going to start with kind of basic interactivity, anything where the view changes over time, and then we'll talk more about multiple views and data reduction as we go. So remember that I already talked about a strategy for handling complexity, which was deriving new data. Now we're going to talk about some of the other really major strategies for this, which is any kind of interactivity of changing a view over time. And we're also then going to talk about the idea of maybe you need more than one view. Maybe a single view cannot fully solve your problem. So let's think about some of the considerations with multiple views. And then later we'll get to this idea of reducing what you see in a single view. So at its most basic, interactivity is anything dynamic, right? The view changes. It's not a single static view. So for example, what could you do? You could change the visual encoding idiom itself. Within a given idiom, you might change the ordering of things. So here's a more complex example of what I showed you with the simple bar chart. If we reorder instead of alphabetically by the order that these occur in English, right, we see it's a very different ability to understand what's going on with the data set simply by reordering. It's the same visual encoding, but it's a data-driven reordering that makes it much easier to see things like extreme values and understand the trends. You don't have to go hunting for smallest and largest. It's all right there. So how might you do this? There are a bunch of idioms that are very aggressive, that have very aggressive information density, where, for example, we're looking at a table where we've got a 1 pixel high line. So we're not seeing details, but we are able to fit a lot of information. These are sometimes called information-dense interfaces or pixel-oriented interfaces. So notice how what we can do by reordering is we can see, is there correlation between these multiple columns? This is a multi-attribute table. And of course, we can see that, well, column 3 and column 5 do seem to be fairly strongly correlated compared to some of the others. So changing the order can let you see what are some relationships between attributes. Now, there was that earlier question about graphics versus visualization. This really is a place where we think in a very graphics way when we think about navigation. So it's easiest to think about navigation as we really do have a metaphor that there is a virtual camera, and we are moving that virtual camera with respect to the data that it is looking at, so a viewpoint. So this is kind of straight up computer graphics. Now, one thing that's different between graphics and visualization is, well, what kinds of zooms are there? And typically in graphics, you have a geometric zoom. When things get further away from the camera, they get smaller. In graphics, that's great because we assume that small, far away things are unimportant. And that actually matches very well, and it allows for scalable algorithms. Now, sometimes in a visualization context, something that's actually quite small might be very important. We might not want a purely geometric zoom. So what's called a semantic zoom is where we can actually have an adaptive visual representation. We don't just have one way to draw it, and it's either big or small. We have different ways to draw that are adaptive based on the number of pixels available. So if you've got a 20 by 20 pixel box, you might do something very different than if you had 800 by 800 pixels. So you can have these adaptive algorithms. That's the general family of idioms that are called semantic zooming. That's got quite a bit of power. We can also simply, pan or translate. Rotation is particularly important to do in 3D. So when you have 3D spatial data, you're almost always going to want to support full rotation. If you don't have 3D data, that tends to be much less interesting in a 2D context. One more point I want to make about navigation, although we're going quite quickly, is it can be very useful instead of just giving them free controls like a helicopter pilot of you can move anywhere by just, essentially moving your camera around. It can be nice to select items of interest and have the system automatically compute a trajectory that frames those within the camera. Often you'll do this through an animated transition instead of simply a jump cut from one to the other. Having a smooth transition makes it much easier to maintain your orientation. So constrained navigation is typically based on some selection set and then an automatically computed navigation path. Some lovely math and papers for doing that if folks are interested. Continuing with this kind of computer graphics approach to thinking about navigation, and this is again particularly interesting when you've got these kind of volumetric 3D data sets. What might we do? We might have this idea of a slicing plane, of taking a slice of the data, particularly if the data was originally acquired through slices, where part of the problem is to reconstruct a 3D shape, but you also often want to go through. It might be aligned on the axes of the original data set or an arbitrary cutting plane where then you want to go deep into some signal processing concerns about appropriate sampling and reconstruction in order to make sure that when you interpolate, you don't have too much error involved. There's some very interesting and nice algorithmic work to do there. But from an idiom point of view, we're just thinking of this as being able to take slices, or more generally to say, well, if we've got a cutting plane, we could not draw everything between the cutting plane and our eye, but draw everything on the other side of that. And so then it's a slice rather than a cut, but it still has this idea of there's some plane that you're using to control what you're seeing. Again, speaking of lovely mathematics, there's all kinds of fun and cool math about how to project, how it is that you could go from a higher dimensionality to a lower dimensionality. And in the simple case, projecting even just from 3D to 2D, that you could either throw away data completely with orthographic projection, you could actually have perspective correction, which is absolutely what you want with 3D spatial data, typically not what you want with abstract data that you're laying out in 2D. All kinds of other interesting projections. It particularly comes up with geographic projections as you have to go from the surface of a sphere to the 2D plane. And if we had time, we would get deep into that, but we have limited time for that today. So what we're going to do then is move on and just realize that what we talked about was that any way of interactively changing an interface over time gives you a great deal of power. So interaction particularly involves selecting some number of points, typically, often items in your data set, and then making changes accordingly. So what else could we do? Besides just changing the display over time, what are our other options? Well, one thing we might do is have more than one view. And let's talk about some of the considerations of those. So when you have views side by side, we can think about, well, do those views have the same visual encoding or are they different? And there's a key idea that we'll talk through about highlighting items in one view and seeing where they fall in the other view. And that's something that gives us a lot of power. We'll think about whether the views have all the data shared between them or a subset or none shared. And we'll think about whether they have linked navigation or not. So at the basics, linked highlighting is an incredibly powerful thing, and thus it's pervasive in visualization. So from a structural point of view, what's going on with linked views? We want to see if contiguous regions in one are also contiguous in the other, or if they're distributed in some interesting way. So here's an example. We're seeing baseball data, and well, all these views are showing different things. We've got a couple of scatter plots, a couple of bar charts, and more of a distribution in the top right. So it's showing the same data if we think about it as items of data, but we're seeing different attributes across these different views. Sometimes you'll hear linked highlighting called brushing and linking. That's another name for it you'll see in the literature. And the key thing here is, what they've done is they've highlighted the people that get paid a lot. That's the log view of salary on the upper right. And then they're analyzing, well, it seems to happen in most positions and even in most levels of seniority. And even in terms of who actually gets assists or gets people put out. But it does seem to be correlated with the number of hits per year, which is this view here on the middle right. So we're able to see when is it correlated and when is it not correlated. So we understand how these items that we see across all the views have different attributes. Another really common idiom is that we think about overview views versus detail views. They could either be exactly the same visual encoding or they could be different. In this case, I'm sure you've all seen geographic maps that have these overview detail views. And so what we're seeing is there's a subset of data in one versus the other. Often these have bidirectional linking. So as you move this rectangle in one view, you see the view change in the detail view and vice versa. Navigating in the detail view will show you the extent of that detail view in that overview. Sometimes they might be the same size, sometimes the overview might be much bigger or the detail view much bigger, as we see here. So another way that idiom that's extremely pervasive is this idea of small multiples, of a repeated visual encoding across many views where you don't show the same data items. You are showing the same attributes, but you can think of this as slicing a data set up. It's usually sliced according to item, although you could do it by attribute. So here's an example. We're seeing stock prices for a bunch of different companies. So, each company's data is different, but it's showing the stock price for all of them. And of course, you are able to make detailed comparisons very quickly because you simply move your eyes between the views and you can do comparisons very, very easily with small multiples. A key thing about small multiples is that they are all actually on the screen at the same time. That once you have to start scrolling, things really change. You want small multiples to be juxtaposed, that is, side by side, in a way that they're all visible. So what are the trade-offs here? The cost of juxtaposing a view is you stole pixels from the other view, right? So kind of by definition, if you split one big view versus two small views, each view must be smaller. So that's so obvious, why am I even telling you this? Well, because we want to think about the costs versus the benefits. So if you move your eyes between two views, that's actually very low cost compared to if you have a single view and it changes over time. What you're forced to do is remember what you saw before and compare that memory to what you see before you. So interactive views have great, great power. You can do a lot of navigation and moving and see a lot of things change, but it's relatively hard to remember what you saw before. So there's a bit of a trade-off here where, of course, if you just kept going with making more juxtaposed views, you'd run out of pixels very soon. So most systems usually have a combination of both juxtaposed views and the ability to actually change all of those views. So there are costs and benefits from both interaction and from juxtaposition, and you always want to think about that trade-off. So here's an example where you might think, oh, but what about animation? So this is actually that same data set that I showed you way back at the beginning. And if I just focus on one of these, okay, yellow, green, kind of green, orange, yellow, green, I've managed to focus on just one node and I have no idea what's happening in the other nodes. The problem is there is stuff happening all over the screen. So the change in every frame is distributed through the entire thing. It's not somehow just one thing moving around in a way that's easy to track. So if there's a lot of scattered changes over many frames, animation's actually quite tricky. So it is very powerful when people custom design animations. The cartoons that you see have people who designed it so that basically one important thing is happening at once. That's what happens when you're storytelling. When it's data-driven, you often can't be guaranteed of that. The special case where animation is really powerful is if you're transitioning between one thing and another, and you're actually animating the camera to help people actually see things, or you're deliberately animating points from one view to another. But where you have purely data-driven things and many, many frames and no set idea of end state, it can be quite hard to track. So we often juxtapose rather than animate if we have the pixel budget to do so with the amount of screen real estate we have. So you can see here that we really did only have, 8 different frames, and yet it was still very difficult to follow, and it's only about 50 points. So thinking about these choices, right, about how much of the data do you see and whether the encoding is the same or different, it allows you to think about these possibilities. So if the encoding is the same and all the data is the same, well, then those two views are just completely identical. That's less interesting. And if everything's different, then you don't have a good way to do any kind of linked highlighting. But thinking about these cases where you either have all the data shared, but different encodings, or none of the data shared because you partitioned into small multiples, or you have this overview detail approach, which can either be same or different encoding, these are some of the 4 major idioms for handling multiple views. So we haven't talked about how do you chop the data up into pieces between the views? How do we partition between views? So a very common way to divide data between views is to split into different regions according to the data, according to attributes. And what that means is that you've essentially encoded the association between items using proximity. And when you see 2 views like that, you automatically think that things sharing the same view are closely linked together because that's a property of our perceptual system. So what that means is the order that you split things, the order of partitioning has a huge impact about what you see easily. So here's an example with grouped bar charts versus small multiple bar charts. This is actually demographic data from 6 different US states. And so if first you split by state into regions, and then within the regions you have a grouped bar, which is basically a glyph made of multiple single bars, well then it's really easy to compare within state, but it's really hard to compare across the ages. You can immediately see on the left that there's roughly the same pattern for every state, and that's trivial to see. But it's kind of harder to compare, the middle-aged people. If you have small multiple bar charts and this is the same data set, then it's quite easy to compare for each of these age ranges, but then it gets harder to make those judgments about is there roughly the same pattern between the states. So the order of partitioning really affects what kinds of judgments are easy to make versus more challenging to make. Usually they're not impossible to make, but easy versus harder is what we're thinking about. So there's another strategy. In addition to partitioning and then having things side by side, you could put things on top of each other. We're going to call that superimposing as opposed to juxtaposing. So if you think about basically having layers of things, often a front and a back are the most basic way to do that, we really want to think about having these distinguishable sets. So there's all kinds of design choices. How many layers can you have? How do you distinguish between the layers? You could try to really you have to make sure that the ability to perceive the layers is there, and you can think of that from a channel point of view, that you're trying to visually encode things with sufficiently non-overlapping ranges in any of the visual channels that you can distinguish. Now, if it's static, it is definitely achievable to have two, like a foreground and a background. If you're really careful, maybe you can get away with 3, but you definitely can't have like 17 or 56 or hundreds, right? It's very, very limited because visual clutter will immediately take over. But if you're doing something interactive that's dynamic, you have a lot more possibilities. So let's just look at a static case. Maps are a classic example of this, where you've got things like the roads that are a foreground layer and the regions which are a background layer. Notice how we've got luminance differences and fully saturated hues for that foreground layer and much less saturated things for the background, land, and water. And you can just move your attention back and forth between them. Maureen Stone has a nice slogan, "Get it right in black and white," which is, and if you want to actually understand you have enough luminance contrast, one thing you can often do is simply get rid of the color and see whether you can understand some of the most crucial things. So that's one way to often check luminance contrast. So let's look at an approach with layering, and we're actually now seeing the combination of layering and juxtaposition. So we have multiple views. And what we've done is we're color coding by year, and we're superimposing within the same frame. And there's actually, what we've done here is this is looking at varieties of wheat and different sites at which the wheat was planted, and then the rows are the varieties of wheat, and notice how that's repeated in these small multiples. This has a nice technique from Bill Cleveland called main effects ordering, where what you do is you figure out the median for the group and you use that to do ordering. So we both ordered the rows by the median of the variety within each of these views, and then the views themselves are ordered by the median of the site. So we're seeing this visual structure, and what you can see is, okay, blue on the left, pink on the right, yup, hey, wait a minute, pink on the left, blue on the right, and then that's the one that's not like the others. In fact, this was a very well-studied data set that until this figure were made, people didn't realize there was actually this property of, wait, is there a bug in the data? What happened here? Why is there something different in Morris? That's something that jumps out at you because of this view, and it would perhaps be harder if they weren't superimposed on each other in this way. It would also be much harder if you hadn't been clevering about this ordering. So it's a nice example of both. You can also do a lot with dynamic layering. Since we're running a bit late, I'm not going to take the time to actually show this demo directly, but here's two different ways where you either have to click and then you see the one-hop neighbors of the neighborhood on the left, or you just move the mouse and even by hovering you see a bunch of one-hop neighbors on the right. The key idea is it's the equivalent of having, hundreds or even thousands of different possible layers depending on which item you have selected. Either by clicking or hovering, you then dynamically change the views to make a foreground and a background layer. And that has a great deal of power. All right, so there's definitely further reading for this one here. And I'm gonna see if we have any Slido questions. Back to color. When choosing color for gender, how do you resolve the conflict? One answer is don't use blue and pink. Any other color, but not the stereotypical blue and pink. It's usually my good rule of thumb. A question about using geometric zoom besides maps. There's a lot of situations, certainly for purely spatial data, geometric zoom often just makes sense. You don't want to do something complex. But there are situations where you really do just have a situation where people want to zoom in to see more detail. They don't want something exotic to happen, like things to change. So there's definitely a lot of situations, even for non-spatial tabular data, where you really do want to zoom in to see more detail. Often zooming in allows you to then fill in detail in that region. So if you want to focus your attention on a smaller number of items, and there might be more detail to fill in for those, that's usually a situation where geometric zooming can make a lot of sense. So it is used quite frequently. All right. We've got one more section to go, so I want to leap into that, which is data reduction. So everything we've talked about has assumed that your data set is small enough that you could actually have one mark for every single item. What about when that's not true? What if you've got 1 million items? What if you've got 10 million items and you have a limited number of pixels? You very quickly get to the point where simply drawing 1 mark per item does not make sense and it doesn't scale. So what are some things we can do? Well, and whenever I say reduce, I'll really be thinking about, you can either reduce or increase depending on which way you want to go. These are inverses of each other. An obvious thing to do is don't draw everything. That's filtering. What's great about it? It's straightforward, it's easy to implement, it's intuitive for people to understand. What's bad about it is whatever you don't see, it's very hard to remember to reason about. So out of sight, out of mind is not just a saying, it's actually a reality. So filtering doesn't allow you to do much with the part that you've thrown away. The alternative is aggregation, where somehow you have an entire set of things that you're not showing and you have a proxy to show something representative of that whole set. And that's what we do when we aggregate. What's bad about this is it's really hard to do in a way that doesn't lose the very signal you're trying to preserve. So the devil is in the details with aggregation. It's difficult. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive. You can do both filtering and aggregation, and most sophisticated interfaces do a combination of both. And of course, it's also possible to use all of these ways of dealing with complexity at once. So deriving data, reducing the amount of data shown per view, having interactive views, and having multiple views. It's very common that we have all of these at once. We talked about them separately to try to analyze and understand. So for example, if we're aggregating, we might have something like reducing the number of items we show where we filter out. It can be quite nice to actually, instead of simply refuse to draw the other things, is to show with layers what is selected and what is not with this kind of filtering. So here's an example where we've got multiple attributes, and filtering on one, we can see what happens with the others. So, and we'll talk in a moment about scented histograms, but basically it's a way to control the range in one and see what happens with the others. So before we talk about scented histograms, let's just remind ourselves of what a histogram is from an analysis point of view. That's a way to aggregate items that's purely static. If you want to find a distribution, you start with a table and you make another table. You derive a new table where the keys in that new table are the bins and the values are the counts of the number of times something occurred in the original. Of course, the size of the bins can really change the shape of this histogram. Interaction can be nice for allowing you to change that bin size on the fly. Now, what people do very frequently, if you want to add power to an interface, is anytime you have a slider, anytime you're controlling something about a single attribute, slam a histogram on top of it. So that instead of forcing people to change the slider and see what happens, you give them a preview of the distribution of that particular attribute. It's called scented widgets because of this idea of an information scent, which came out of the Xerox PARC framing of information foraging, of people looking for information analogous to animals. So that's why we have that particular use of the term. What's really caught on is histograms on sliders. So, that was an original example. Here's an example of a complex system for network drawing where notice how with a really small number of pixels, we're able to see a bunch of these attributes. And the key thing is we can instantly see, aha, normal distributions, power laws, bimodal distributions, something that looks like it must be categorical data because it's all the same height. So this is a small number of pixels in a region you might have thought of as purely for control, can also be used to show information about the data itself. Here's another example with aggregation where, going back to that question about scatter plots and overplotting, what could you do? Well, you could actually keep track of the overplotting and encode that, in this case, with a color palette that's one of those multiple hues, monotonic luminance increasing color palettes. So there's a way to think about this as derived data. You take your original scatter plot and you actually check how many things are being overplotted at each point. So think of a table with the number of pixels in the original one. And so you actually have this very dense space-filling two-dimensional matrix, which is every pixel of the original one. And then we can actually color code. Now, of course, algorithmically, what we do is not necessarily derive tables, but do something clever with the GPU to actually make this fast. But what that means is suddenly we can support millions of items. So we don't have the same scalability constraints we had before because we're aggregating information about everything within that pixel, in this case, by having a monotonically increasing luminance color coding. Now, aggregation gets even more tricky when we start thinking about spatial data. Geographers have been contending with this for a long time. They have fancy acronyms like MAUP, the Modifiable Areal Unit Problem, which basically notes that when you change the boundaries of the regions, everything can change. So what they call zone effects are, notice how we've got the same data points in all these pictures, but depending on how you chop it up into regions, you either see something where everything's dense in the middle and then it sort of drops off, or you see a much larger middle when we have this sort of Voronoi style partition. Or if we partition in this other way, it doesn't seem like there's actually too much density in the middle at all. It's the same data, but we chopped it into regions differently. We get what's called scale effects when you change the size of the regions. This is just like changing the size of bins in a histogram. So aggregation is a very, very tricky problem. And spatial aggregation is just one special case of the trickiness of how do you aggregate. It has huge effects in terms of how the data looks from a visual encoding point of view. Here's coming back to that idea of making a cluster hierarchy. We didn't talk in great detail about parallel coordinates because there wasn't any time today, but it's basically a way of having a jagged line represent a single data point with axes that are in parallel to each other rather than perpendicular as they are with standard Cartesian coordinates. The part I want you to notice is, what if you had a lot of these lines? It's just chaos, you can't see everything, there's too much overplotting. If you go through and you cluster the lines based on their similarity, and then you can interactively decide how many clusters to show. Far away on the left, we have just one cluster and you see roughly their span. You can see a few more clusters and then you start to see a bit more detail or even more. But this is a data set with hundreds of thousands of lines and you can still actually get some sense of what's going on because you have clustered the data and then used the cluster to drive how much you show. And that is a dynamic way to use aggregation that's actually common to a lot of different particular idioms. So dimensionality reduction is also something that's basically aggregation, but now you're not aggregating the items, you're actually aggregating the dimensions themselves. What we have been talking about is attributes. But one reason this is called dimensionality reduction is that in this literature, people often refer to these things I've been calling attributes as dimensions. And you think about going from a high dimensional space to a low dimensional space. Why would you ever do this? Well, if you have a small number of attributes and they're meaningful, you would never aggregate across them. But what if you're in a situation where you can't measure what you want? So, for example, you have something where you want to know, is it a tumor or not? But you can't measure that. We don't have instruments that say that. We have instruments that compute things like the density of this. And so there are often things where you might be able to measure 9 different things in a high dimensional space. You project down to a lower dimensional space. In this case, if you knew ground truth of what was benign and what was malignant, you can also notice that they seem to form clusters. So just the position of the points is telling you something. This is a situation where sometimes this is called a hidden variable or a latent factor, something that you think is going on in the data set but you can't measure, so you conjecture that what you measured is a much more verbose and sprawling way, and there's a more concise and compact way to actually see what's going on. So there's a lot of really lovely algorithmic stuff going on here. All that I'm going to point out for now is that we can think of this as a chained series of tasks, where let's say you have a high dimensional data set for documents where you have 40,000 documents and the total number of words across these documents is maybe 20,000 words. Well, that's an incredibly high dimensional table. You can take each word and count how many times it occurs in each document. You don't directly look at that. What you do is you reduce the dimensionality down from this very, very sparse data set to this lower dimensional data set where maybe you say, well, what happens if we project down to 2 dimensions instead of, say, 20,000 dimensions? Then those 40,000 points might actually form some clusters. And then what we could do is look at some examples and try to decide, what is this group of documents about? Maybe it's all Australian documents about wombats. So we annotate the cluster based on interactive exploration. So this is an example use case that's quite common, for example, for looking at these dimensionally reduced plots of documents. This is also very common in dealing with any kind of embedding latent space stuff if you're dealing with visualization and machine learning results. Okay, so there's also further reading on that front. Now, what we've done is we've sort of walked through a whole bunch of ideas, trying to think about these 4 levels of domain, abstraction, idiom, and algorithm through the lens of what and why and how. So we talked about what in terms of data, why in terms of task, and then how in terms of all these different ways to visually encode and interact, so the space of idioms. So there is lots more in a book. This tutorial is based on that book. And also some of the stuff that my own group does. But what I want to do now is jump back over to the Slido and look at more questions, if there are some. We can also take questions from folks in the room. Or we can say that we've run way over and we only have 3 more minutes. But I have faith. There must be some question out there. Going once. Aha, yes, go for it.
So that's a lot of information. It's all very, really information. I'm wondering where you're going now. You know, we've seen that one for a while, and so I'm wondering where your questions are now. Because I have faith.
Aha, okay, so for those in hybrid land who couldn't hear, the question is, so yep, that was a giant fire hose of stuff, but what am I thinking about now? Where am I going? This book's been out for a while. So the short answer is, I have many thoughts. So in particular, after spending the last 8+ years trying to actually not only teach from this myself, but use exercises other people like Enrico Bertini developed to teach out of the book and then use in my own classes, it's really made me rethink chapter 5 on marks and channels. And so I have some different ideas about marks and channels than I did when I wrote the first edition. So before I write a second edition, there's a research paper I need to write that will be called Marks Revisited, and questioning this dogma of points, lines, and areas that we've had ever since Bertin in the 60s. So I have some thoughts. They need to be crisped out and written down in a research paper, but I think there's a lot of ways that everyone has just been thinking about it that don't actually help us reason enough. So I want to redo that, and I think that will lead to some of the stuff I do in class. There's a lot of in-class exercises. What you've seen here is here's all the information, which in my class I often either have them read the book or have them watch the videos, but then in class we work together. So I've got a bunch of exercises that I both borrowed from others and then adapted and tweaked myself and came up with some on my own. If people are interested in those, they're all available if you go to the book page, which is at on here. Then there's a lot of pointers to those. But doing those in-class exercises and have people ask questions like, but wait, how does the theory of marks and channels help us reason about this one? And for a while, my answer was, let me think. And so I thought. It took me 5+ years, but I've thought. So that's one big thing, is I really do want to sort of go back into that question of marks and channels and say, what if everything we assumed for the past 50 years wasn't quite right? There's many other things I want to do as well in terms of finer tuning, but that's the big one. Let's see, are there any other questions on Slido? Yes.
So a lot of this is when you know the attribute or you know kind of what the function represents, but how do you start when you don't know what is the word?
Right, so the question was, this was really focused on, well, you know the attribute and you know what you want to do with the attribute, but what if you don't? So there's different answers to that. So one answer is that that method of design study methodology is all about trying to gradually figure out, but wait, what data do these people even have and what are they even trying to do? And with design study methods, where you're sort of starting with a real world problem and trying to abstract and then encode and then build, that there's an iterative process of trying to understand, what is this data set? What are you guys doing? What is going on? So one answer is use kind of user-centered iterative design methods to gradually figure that out and be able to keep checking back quickly rather than, you don't spend 6 months building a prototype and then another 2 years optimizing the heck out of it for scalability and then show it to the people and have them be like, oh no, you got that wrong. Not that we're bitter, but so you have to, one thing is try to work with people to understand it. Another answer is maybe you can use some of these underlying theories to actually have some automatic recommender systems. A super cool paper, if I do say so myself, that Anna Kersan is first author on is going to be presented later on in this week, Gevet Rec, which is saying, what if we use some of these principles to automatically try to say, given a data set, try to infer when attributes are linked together and do a very quick thing for what we call data reconnaissance. Figuring out with data recon, it's like, what the heck is in this bunch of data sets? Where are they connected? What's going on? What are these attributes? It might not be nearly as good as something that you handcrafted with a design study over 6 months, but if it takes 90 seconds, then fantastic. So some of these answers of what do you do depends a lot on whether you're really, where you are on the generality versus specificity axis. Are you doing something handcrafted boutique with users where you've got 6 to 9 months? Do you have 90 seconds? Did somebody just dump a data set in your lap and you want some vague situational awareness of what's going on? Are you maybe somewhere in between? So you can kind of think about tools at different points on that general purpose tool versus ultra specific, lovingly handcrafted thing. That was a great question. I see one more, maybe before we wrap up. What are my thoughts on the effect of interaction on the effectiveness of visual encodings? So there's a whole literature on that. There's a lot of people who say we must have more interaction and more interaction design. And then there's a lot of people who are like, but interaction has a cost, right? There's a time cost of interaction. It actually literally will take you time to interact and see things. And so when is that cost worth the benefit? The short answer is, if there's a paradigm where selecting a small number of things will allow you to then dive more deeply and explore, there's often a lot of power in that. So interaction does have a lot of power. It's also the case that, for example, Gregor Reich of the New York Times was quoted as saying, I forget what the number is, whether it was 70% or 90%, but some huge percentage of the time they don't interact. All people do is scroll down, all that interactive stuff they just don't do. They don't choose to take the time to do that. So I think it depends, when you bother putting in interaction depends on the length of time you pause it. Do you have 30 seconds or do you have, hours a day over 6 months in terms of the user use kind of profile? And in terms of just that low-level question of, for example, as things start to have dynamic motion, what can you actually perceive from a perceptual point of view? The short answer is we don't know. I have a talk I gave to a bunch of vision science people about here's all the things we want to know. And they're like, okay, now we'll be busy for 100 years. Like, to actually do these low-level, careful experiments to understand, not just the relationship between different visual encoding channels, but how they're affected by interaction. There's a huge amount of empirical work left to do to figure that out. So it is a hard problem, but a good one. Staying on time is also a hard problem, and let's approximate it by declaring victory for now. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions for those in the room for longer, but since we're a few minutes over, let's declare victory for now with the hybrid session and wrap up, and thank you so much.